My name is Dr. Matthew Swallow. I'm hailing from the Pittsburgh area. I did my DMA studies at West Virginia University, studying with Michael Abraham, and I did my dissertation on focusing on this, which is what I'm going to be sharing with you today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and just play a first piece titled Ritual Composition, titled Two Suspended Images, composed by William Moylan. history of the MIDI electronic wind instrument runs a parallel timeline with the development of other electronic instruments, including keyboard synthesizers, drum machines, and MIDI guitar synthesizers. The electronic wind instrument, also known as the EWI, is uniquely designed so that it's accessible to a musician with prior experience on any woodwind instrument. And the purpose of this lecture recital is to not only outline the historical aspects of the EWI, but also understand the many performing potentials this device could be capable of beyond traditional woodwind instruments. The first place that I just performed to just now is a piece again, Two Suspended Images by William Moylan, which uses the Yamaha WX, which in this particular model I played the WX5, accompanied with the WT11 wind tone generator, also produced by Yamaha, which we will discuss a little bit later on. And this was actually originally written for saxophonist and publisher Bruce Ronkin in 1990. During the mid-1970s, there was much experimentation with a unique electronic instrument, the first of its kind, the Lyricon, invented by Bill Bernardi and Roger Noble. The Lyricon used fairly similar fingers to the saxophone and mainly controls the accompanying synthesizer unit, such as a MIDI tone generator or VST software. The electronic wind instrument functions using a transducer system to convert wind pressure into the synthesizer and control electronic data that is responding to the physical air by the user. And also during this time period, the EV, or also known as the electronic valve instrument, was being developed by Niles Steiner, which also resembles the fingering mechanisms and mechanical mechanisms of brass instruments like trumpets or horn. The evolution of the synthesizer continued to have further commercial success after the 1983 established industry standard of MIDI, which stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, which is still widely used today. This allows the performer to operate their synthesizers with any sound source regardless of the brand or company instead of being limited to just one device. Even though my primary equipment is through Yamaha, there are other brands including Roland, Korg, and other synthesizers that will communicate between each of those various companies through that industry standard of MIDI. In other words, the signals sent from the controller to the sound source are going to translate the same. In 1987, Yamaha began producing the WX series, starting with the WX7 model invented by Sal Gallina. The Akai company, which also took over Niles Steiner's EV operations, began producing their commercial line of instruments, which also continues to prosper in today's markets. And by the end of the 1980s, Yamaha and Akai were the leaders in the electronic wind instrument industry and were popular among many artists moving towards the 1990s. Some of these jazz artists also include Michael Brecker, Bob Mitzer, and Dave Koz. And also on the classical side, especially in the saxophone world here, we also have John Sampson, the late Kenneth Fisher, Deborah Rickmeyer, and Bruce Ronkin. And from the early 2000s through today, the current leading companies of electronic wind controllers include Akai, Roland, and Yamaha. However, unfortunately, back in 2017, Yamaha discontinued all productions of their wind controllers. However, over the years, Akai has periodically released newer EWI models, such as the latest EWI 5000, as you see on the left-hand side of the slide here, which includes easier accessibility of sound production through internal components on the controller, along with computer and speaker connections, which also include wireless capabilities. Now, even though Yamaha discontinued their line, Roland released the Aerophone AE10 back in 2016, which they finally made their entry into the EV market. In an effort to further appeal to prospective beginning musicians on the EWI, just last year, Roland released a beginner-friendly version of their digital wind instrument known as the AE1 Aerophone. In comparison to the AE10, this model follows the traditional recorder fingering system in comparison to the similar systems on saxophone, clarinet, or flute. Similar to the latest Akai model instruments, the Roland Aerophone line allows for easy connectivity to computers and smartphone tablet apps, along with internal speaker components for easy setup and play. With the particular model I play on is the Yamaha WX5, which was the last of the wind controllers produced by Yamaha. However, many of the parameter features in this brand are very similar concepts to the other EWIs that are out there in the market. For example, the WX5 is able to adjust to many different parameter settings, such as lip rate control, which you can adjust the sensitivity in terms of how much you want to bend the pitch or manipulate the sound through modulation. Additional features also include being able to transpose, have it set as a transposing instrument. Now for all the pieces that I'm performing on today, they're all in C, but I can have it transposed to either E-flat or B-flat instruments as well. Now some of the other fingering preferences too also you can also change the response and speed. Usually I like to have it set at fast speed so I get more of that realistic response, but you can have it set to a low response, especially if you're just beginning to learn how to play the instrument. But it also allows you to do multiple parameter settings, which allows you to do, even similar to saxophone, you can do timbral trills, which is pretty cool. And this pretty much translates to all the different, regardless of what tone module or software that you're using, because all the commands are coming from the wind controller itself. Now, you can also adjust the wind velocity response, where you can actually set where it may require you to use more air to push through the wind instrument, where you get that, especially if you're playing that simulation of playing on a harder, stiff reed, you can adjust those things as such. And then one of the unique features too, which we also have the pitch bend modulation key, which is very similar to what you see on a keyboard synthesizer if you play around with those pitch bend wheels. It's the same exact concept on the wind controller as well, where I can do different pitch bends, such as this. And that goes up to a whole step. And depending on the particular sound patches, I know on this one here, you can have it set where you can do instant vibrato with the pitch bend wheel. And that was the clarinet sound, though. With classical clarinet, you don't usually use vibrato, but it's a pretty nifty little feature there. Now, some additional features also include being able to do sustained pitch drone sounds. Like for instance, it's actually on the bottom of the wind control right underneath the thumb rest, where if I'm playing one pitch, I could do two-part harmony. So it's a pretty cool little feature, especially if you're looking at doing some, and I'm going to be doing some of that even later on today and some other pieces as well. Now, and then of course you could do program change keys, which allows you, it's just actually this bomb key where you can actually change the patches remotely on the wind controller itself. Now, one of the most unique features, of course, is the reed. Now, just keep in mind that the purpose of this reed on the wind controller is not to, vibrate to produce the pitch. It's all, like I said earlier, going through a Bluetooth trigger, which produces the sound. The purpose of the reed is to do the different pitch bends. That's like an example, but let me try this one here instead. See, so it kind of gives a little bit of simulation of those different pitch bend settings there. Now, again, and then also keep in mind that this wind controller is the whole entire range of the keyboard instrument as well. So you can play throughout the physical range of the keyboard on the wind controller itself. Now, moving on from the wind controller itself, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the MIDI tone generators and VST software. And the purpose of this device is to produce the sounds from the synthesizer and create an output of voices that are programmed within the tone generator. And the device contains many parameter settings which can be programmed to produce new ones, and specify tone modules with breath control settings are necessary for simulating the wind response from the EWI itself. And other settings include adjusting reverb, specific transpositions beyond what might be able to be controlled from the wind controller itself. And examples, as you can see here on the slide, there's the WT11 that I'm using here today, but there are also other various tone generators that can be used as well. I actually own the VL70M, which I actually just got about a month ago, and it's very awesome. Yeah, and I'm hoping to do some more projects with that later in the future. But then there's other synthesizers that can be used, including the TX81Z and TG55 tone generators, where you can program sound patches with the specific breath control settings to simulate that response. Now, William Moylan's two suspended images required me to program these specific sound patches using these multiple parameter settings, which of course, whenever I'm programming it manually into my synthesizer, it could be a very tedious process, especially like, it's pretty similar to plugging things into a calculator, but very basic. But it could be a little bit discouraging for a prospective performer to perform this particular piece, especially if you don't have the specific hardware. Even though in the notes he does say that you can program your own custom sound patches, I find it to be very discouraging, just because you're not sure what the piece is supposed to sound like, especially if he has these specifications. Now, of course, added on to that too is like, well, after I perform this piece, what if I want to switch back to some other sound patches without having to program all this all over again just to perform this piece? Well, there's a solution to that, which I'm able to back up those sound patches from here right onto my Mac using SysX Librarian, which is a Mac OS application, which allows you to back up those sound patches onto your computer. That way you can retrieve it next time you are to perform this piece. Now, as we're kind of going into software, this kind of segues into another synthesizer, which I've used quite a bit, which is the Korg Wave Station, for another piece that I'll be performing for you in just a few minutes. And though it could be, adding up all this hardware could be expensive, plus who has the space for all this? Now, fortunately, Korg, many years ago, developed an emulator version of the Korg Wave Station, which is a great tool, and which also, and in this case too, the next piece titled not Two Suspended Images, In a Spoke of Things Transfigured by Leonard V. Ball, and I collaborated with him in reconstructing these sound patches from the original hardware into the software version. And unfortunately, he did pass away a couple months ago, and I wasn't aware of it until a couple weeks ago, which I was glad I was able to have the opportunity to work with him to reconstruct this piece. And this was also written for Kenneth Fisher as well. In addition to that, I'm also using some additional hardware, including a MIDI foot controller along with a volume control pedal as well. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and for you Leonard V. Ball's In a Spoke of Things Transfigured. One thing too, for this particular one, I actually had to adjust the parameters. Since I don't want to do necessarily pitch bends in this piece, I want to manipulate the sound in different methods. One thing, as I was kind of going through the application, I forgot to open up one application, which kind of made it hard to get all the sounds at the beginning there, but I made it work either way with some different controls there. Kind of continuing on to the next part here. The electronic wind instrument has the potential to be a great instrument in the realm of contemporary music. However, there was only a short span of written classical contemporary work specifically for the MIDI electronic wind instrument. After the Yamaha WX series was developed, music began to be written or rearranged for the instrument starting around 1988, and it suddenly began to dissolve around the mid-1990s, which leads to many questions. First, why is there a limited amount of original literature for the wind controller? Or did many consider the EWI to be a novelty instrument which may have not been considered a serious instrument to write for? Or was the EWI part of the overall 1980s trend of electronic synthesizers that became less prominent moving into the next decade? This leads to one of my goals, which is to restore as many of the original works from the late 80s and early 90s and commission new literature specified for the wind instrument. This would include compiling discography and also professional recordings as well. And one of the challenges with the current library is that many of the works are not published. However, it is possible to contain some of these works through contacting the composers directly. It is great that the MIDI tone generators and sound patches are much easier to access through software purchases instead of using the original hardware. I would like to see companies such as Yamaha and Akai to look into that direction in the future as some of the older tone generators like WT11 become more difficult to obtain. This not only creates easier accessibility for a performer to get the correct sounds, but also allows for a proper performance of the piece with a lower price tag of software. And the overall technology of computers and compatibility with the EWI has improved drastically over the years. And composers of possible new works for the instrument can easily adapt and program new patches by using common software that everyone can access, such as the Chord Wave Station. And there are a number of older works that have not been played for years due to the age of the equipment. However, I am confident that I can continue to work with composers and arrangers to reconstruct some of the patches and other sounds that were used when originally performed. And this process will be much also easier and helpful with the aid of live performance recordings. Now, I have contributed to this by making this process easier through compiling a comprehensive repertoire list and discography, which can be found in my dissertation, as you can see here on the slide. And a lot of it focuses on the WX's pedagogy, technical specifications, the hardware, and study of some of the selected works as well. And one of the most recent pieces I restored was an original work from 1989 titled The Hammer and the Arrow, composed by Greg Fish. It was written for John Sampson, and it was made for the Yamaha WX7 and computer. But there's more to that. If you could look over at the original hardware specifications on the left-hand side of the slide, it requires all these different tone modules, along with the old Macintosh, along with additional proprietary cables. Now, what I've done is I've modified it by reducing that list by almost half, which makes it a little bit easier. But I also, what I did was I also found the original score along with a recording of the performance. And what I did was I transferred the whole score in the finale, which was a long process that probably took me about a month or so to compile. And then along with making the MIDI tracks try to match up with some modern sounds using Garriton instruments and other modern MIDI instruments altogether. Now, in addition to the actual performance sounds, I use application software through Apple, which is MainStage 3. I'm not sure if any of you have been familiar with that. It's pretty much an extension to Logic Pro 10, which has some of those sounds, but this is kind of more for live performance purposes, which I find it to be very easy to use in comparison to Ableton Live or Max MSP. And along with that, and I even used it on the previous piece, I also used, let me go ahead and slide this over here real quick. I also used a Logic Pro remote app, which I actually use on my iPad, which I was using to switch to the sound patches on the previous piece, which makes it pretty easier to switch to those different sounds just by the click of a finger. And then one of the important settings that I use is actually a MIDI event processor, which translates the MIDI signals from the wind controller to tell the Mac that I'm using breath control settings, which simulates that wind response. And again, it is still a challenge to locate and restore original works for electronic instrument, especially ones from the late 1980s and 1990s. However, it is important to also continue pursuing new collaborations with composers looking to write for the instrument. And though there are limited resources that may prohibit composers in being able to create sophisticated works without understanding the parameter specifications in the peripheral equipment. Now, a few years ago, I did collaborate with a colleague in composing a new work that takes advantage of the EWI's features in accompanying software. However, when composing the piece, the most important aspect that I kept in mind while working on it is emphasizing the idea of accessibility. Now, what I mean by accessibility is I like to have other performers other than me be able to perform these pieces, which means being able to have easy access to the specified equipment needed to play with relative ease. Now, in conclusion, I hope this presentation on the electronic wind instrument has given you a unique perspective and understanding of understand this musical instrument, which is one that is great to learn how to play and also be able to compose new music for. And there are many great potentials that can allow a woodwind musician to obtain further creativity and techniques that would not otherwise be possible to execute on traditional instruments. And overall, we looked at the history of the EWI, technical specs, challenges regarding hardware, software, and literature. And I just wanted to reemphasize my goal here in the future through bringing awareness of these problems and being able to create solutions for the older MIDI wind control literature, along with getting future works written. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and conclude this lecture with a performance of Greg Fish's The Hammer and the Arrow.